So, Dan, I've got a complicated question for you here, so I'm going to read some of it. A number of European retailers, including H&M from Sweden, Inditex from Spain, Tesco from the UK, Benetton from Italy, the usual European suspects, created an agreement that was designed to improve safety standards and the enforcement of the standards and wage issues among the factories they deal with. And this agreement that the signatories signed up on had some legally binding agreements or conditions. Very few U.S. retailers agreed to sign that agreement. Instead, companies like Walmart, The Gap, JCPenney, Sears Holdings, and others preferred to work among themselves with their trade associations, the National Retail Federation, and with the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., to develop their own plan, which will be announced soon, sometime early July. So, two questions here. Why do you think the U.S. retailers were unwilling to sign the European plan? And secondly, do you think that maybe, what would it take for the Europeans to be willing to sign the U.S. plan? Told you it was complicated.
It is.
You're the expert on international marketing, so it's appropriate.
Well, and I have, again, a complicated response to a complicated question. So I think one of the main drivers or reasons for the American retailers being uncomfortable signing the agreement was just a difference between legal systems between kind of the Eurozone, the European Union, and the United States. And the United States has the highest number of lawyers per capita. We have a fairly litigious country, our legal system. And beyond that, we have some different laws around liability, around the ability to do class action suits. So the legal implications for U.S. retailers are different than they would be for the European retailers. I was reading an article in the Journal that was talking about the potential for a Bangladeshi class action suit, Bangladeshi workers against Walmart, and that this could potentially, probably a small chance, but could potentially be a result of this. So the legal system difference is one of the drivers. There's also just a relationship with government and a cultural difference. American businesses tend to like to self-regulate, a little less comfortable with government action. European businesses are more comfortable with government regulation and have a higher expectation of government getting involved and playing that role. So I think there are a couple different things driving the U.S. retailers not signing on. In the case of the European retailers, I think that's a hard question until we know exactly what that end agreement is and how binding it is, what the terms are, what the implications would be. I do know, based on previous discussion, some of the people involved in the agreement, the National Retail Federation, Olympia Snowe, the current senator, George Mitchell, and these are, as we phrased it, heavy hitters. These are big names. Mm-hmm. So I imagine something is going to come from this. And it's probably going to be something that's pretty comprehensive. And I wouldn't be surprised if the European retailers jumped on. Lastly, I think there's a separate issue regarding consumers as well. I talked earlier that I didn't feel like consumers were that sensitive to this issue. Those consumers that are more likely to be located in Europe. So I think European retailers needed to take quicker action to respond to this issue. I think there were more concerns in the European market among consumers over this problem than there was in the American market. So I think they, from a public relations, from a brand perspective, they wanted to move quickly. And I think the American retailers were in a space that they could take a little more time.
Yeah, and there's also the fact that the two sets of labels that were found in the Rubber Plaza rubble were European and H&M and Benetton labels. Right. There's a little more pressure. So what's different now? I mean, what's changed to make people think that this change has caused these, or at least contributed to the pressures on these factories?
Well, then there has been a significant change. Many years ago, you had a situation where the manufacturer dictated the length of, for example, the length of a woman's skirt. This season being 26 inches, and the next season being 32, the next season being 42 inches. And as a result of that, that's how they were able to obsolete the wardrobe that the individual had and help drive business. But at some point in time, the consumer said, stop. I'm going to wear the length of skirt in which I'm comfortable. And the consumer took control. And as a result of that change, the consumer started to dictate to the supplier as opposed to the supplier dictating to the consumer. That changed the entire industry. And most manufacturers of substance were able to make the transition and made the change to where they were responding to the consumer and being more consumer driven, as opposed to many suppliers who also did not try to or successfully make the transition and ended up not surviving. And that's why one of the reasons why the industry has shrunk as much as it has, because the consumer took control. As a result of that, you now have a situation where the consumer is dictating not just the length of their skirt, but everything that is taking place with their wardrobe. And that is not a universal point of view. Because of the diversity of the population, you have diversity in fashion. So where one group of customers may want a skirt length of 32 inches, another one may want one that's 26 inches. And that diversity has added to a great deal of excitement and innovation and I think progress in the way that people view their wardrobe and the way they live, their lifestyles, and that's being reflected throughout all aspects of, I think, the population today, which has made it, in my opinion, a much more exciting place to live. It basically celebrates differentiation and differences, and yet keeps us as a universal population. So it's actually been a very healthy thing, but it is no longer being dictated. Fashion is no longer being dictated by suppliers. It's being dictated by the consumer, and I believe that's healthy.
Yeah, and I agree with Dennis in that consumers have taken more control. Consumers may not feel like it, but they really are driving the bus, if you will. And this is across all industries, essentially. It's not just the textile industry. Consumers have more and more power. But I feel like that this puts some pressure on the system as well. If you, there's a classic business school model of rivalry among competitors, Michael Porter's 5 forces. And one of those forces is the bargaining power of consumers. And as consumers have more bargaining power, competition gets more fierce. Rivalry among competitors gets more fierce. And this puts pressure on the system. And as systems get more pressure on them and there's more competition, that increases the incentive to potentially cut a corner. Hopefully nobody would do that, but it does increase the pressure to make those, take those sort of steps. I also think technology and technological changes have played a key role. I was at a Taiwanese research and development company, and they had gotten essentially an email from Nike headquarters, and they printed out a 3D shoe for me to hold, and this was the newest LeBron shoe. So you have this technological role that is increasing the ability of manufacturers to respond to these different consumer markets. They can be more responsive, they can be more efficient, they can customize and make changes more quickly. And I think that's an important change that should be noted over the last couple of decades.
So if the consumer is driving the ship, why don't they drive the ship to safer factories and higher wages? In other words, take a course that doesn't put such pressures or incentives, if you will, for some cost cutting and corner cutting and lax enforcement. If they've got the power, why don't they do something about it?
You want to take that?
Sure. To some degree they have. To some degree the standards and the processes that Dennis has been talking about are in response to consumer pressures. Some of them are in response to just best practices, doing the moral or the right thing by companies, but some are in response to those consumer pressures. Companies don't want to be in a position where they are repeat offenders and they are repeatedly in stories such as this tragedy in Bangladesh. That would hurt their brand image over time, and you could see consumers start to migrate away from those companies. And you see micro segments of consumers within Europe, within the American market, that won't buy at Walmart because they feel Walmart pays a low wage, they feel that Walmart is not a good business actor, or they may prefer not to buy from big box stores in general. So there are certainly pockets of consumers that exert a lot of pressure on these issues. So I wouldn't say that consumers aren't playing a role and aren't putting a lot of pressure on businesses. But I think there's also the counterfact that I don't know how sensitive consumers are to the issue. I think if it was repeat offenders, if it was something that was happening over and over again, there would be a lot more sensitivity. But when they seemed like isolated incidents where it's a foreign-owned company and there are quick steps in response, I don't know how many consumers really are making their purchasing decision based on country of origin. I don't know how many consumers went out and were shopping at Walmart or Target and looked at the t-shirt and said, oh, this was manufactured in Bangladesh, I'm not going to buy it. I'm not sure how many people are actually that sensitive.
I think it's a good point, because the reality, the consumer expects the retailer to maintain the standards of expectation. And as a result of that, the major retailers, particularly the larger retailers, have taken ownership and I think a much higher level of citizenship and leadership in standards of operating, and standards of sourcing, and factory certification programs. Those kinds of things have now become much more a part of the norm of this is the price of entry to do business today. You no longer hear about the cases of child labor or factory certification programs that still tolerate the kind of things that may have taken place even 20 years ago. So the standards have improved because they've had to be improved in order to protect the brand and the major retailers. Walmart, a Target, a Gap Corporation is not going to risk their entire company, their business, by doing something stupid short term, short range. It just doesn't, it's not good business. It's good business to actually raise the standard, and that's the expectation of the consumer.
Well, you know, I think if I may add something or take my own perspective, one of the nice things about being in charge is that you're in charge, so you can demand everything. So I think the attitude, the consumer, at least subconsciously, is I want the fashions I want, and styles, colors. I want them as quickly as I want to have them. I want to change them, 4, 5, 6 times a year, because that's the way I want to do things, and I want to pay a tiny price for them. And oh, by the way, of course I expect them to have these garments made under conditions of good human rights and labor rights and so on and so forth. My job is to choose what I'm going to buy. It's the retailer's job to choose where and how they make it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would add one last thought on this from an international marketing perspective. And that is, in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see the emergence of Chinese retailers, Brazilian retailers, Indian retailers, and their expectations on these issues are going to be different. In Bangladesh, for example, there is an issue with child labor, but those companies aren't manufacturing for Western companies. Those factories are manufacturing often for other emerging markets that have different expectations around these issues and different standards. So it'll be interesting to watch the story evolve over time as these other economies become more global players.
It's a very good point, Dan. But what I'm finding internationally is that as economies develop, the expectation of quality is rising. The expectations of the consumer continues to improve and reach a higher level, much like the history of what took place within our own country. So I believe as time goes on, the standards of expectation are going to continue to rise just as they have in this country and in other developed countries. Because second standard working conditions are not going to be acceptable in any country at some point in time. Not the case today, but this becomes much more of a true global economy, much more of a true global consumer with great differentiation, different taste levels, different desires, different admirations and ambitions, but they're still being manifested in common quality ways of production and the way you live your life.